As I discussed in our previous episode of this series, false flags are a specific tool of state propaganda and manipulation designed to achieve ends that would otherwise be impossible to justify. I explained what elements they often contain, as well as why, in my view, they are a specifically modern phenomenon. That might seem strange to you. After all, weren't people in the ancient world just as cunning and deceptive and every bit as power-hungry as people of today? And the answer to that is yes, they often were. But the ancient world has left us scant evidence of false flags, certainly in the way we understand them today. Now, it may be that there were false flags we will never know about, secret operations that were so successful that they evaded any suspicion and were never detected. Sure, that's possible. But the fact remains that the available evidence gives us very little to go on. There does not even appear to have been a great deal of suspicion of false flags for the vast majority of the ancient world. Even so, there are indeed a few events of our earlier history that do look like false flags, or at least very possible false flags, and they are definitely worth our investigation. As you will see, what is so interesting about them is not necessarily how similar they were to false flags of today, although a few of them were, but really how very different they were, very different. By looking at these early forms of false flags, I would say we begin to gain a better understanding of how this phenomenon, one of the worst forms of manipulation and deception in our world, has developed and evolved over time. Let's start with ancient Rome. Whenever you do hear people talking about false flags as an ancient phenomenon, you often hear them refer to the burning of Rome in 64 AD. A massive fire began on the night of July 18th and burned out of control for 5 days. Nearly 1/3 of Rome was burned to the ground, and much more was severely damaged. There are several ancient sources of the Great Fire, and unfortunately none of them are primary sources, and only one qualifies as a secondary account. In other words, not ideal. Even so, historians feel that they have a pretty good handle on the events, if not perfect. It appears that Emperor Nero wanted to build a series of palaces, which he planned to name Domus Aurea. This structure would have required a large part of Rome to be torn down, and the Senate rejected the idea. Then, luckily for Nero, the fire cleared much of the area that his project required. People knew of Nero's plans for the Domus Aurea, and as a result, rumors spread that he helped to start the fire, either by openly sending men out to do the job or by secretly sending them out where they pretended to be drunk and then set fire to the city. If you read what modern historians have to say about this, they generally discount the idea. Most seem to rely on the most prestigious historian of ancient Rome named Tacitus and agree with him that Nero was probably in the city of Antium, about 30 miles south of Rome, when the fire broke out. Keep in mind that fire was a constant menace in ancient cities. In addition, the Great Fire also damaged Nero's own palace, and he appears to have rushed back from Antium to organize a relief effort. He opened his palaces to let in the homeless and had food supplies delivered to survivors. It's also said that in the aftermath, Nero devised a new urban development plan that would make Rome less vulnerable to fire. He also, however, gave himself a huge tract of city property with the intention of building his new palace there. So, with Rome rife with rumors that Nero caused the fire, it does certainly appear that Nero found a scapegoat. This was the new religious cult of Christianity, members of which met in secret, refused to worship the emperor, and looked forward to the end of the world and the destruction of Rome's power. Conservative, patriotic Romans looked at these Christians as something like terrorists. Tacitus tells us that Nero blamed the fire on the Christians, and then to appease the public, or feed his own bloodlust, who knows, he had them literally fed to lions in massive spectacles. Like so many events in ancient history, we will never have complete information about the Great Fire of Rome. That's just the reality of the situation. We can imagine, even after 2,000 years, that Nero might have played a role in it. After all, Tacitus, while a great historian and probably the most reliable voice of that period, was simply one source. So we really will never know. If you think of the elements that go into a false flag, as I discussed in our very first episode, you'll find that the Great Fire has a few of them, but certainly not all. It was a spectacular and traumatic event, and while there was no real media to speak of back then, it is true that Nero seemed quickly and conveniently to blame the Christians. The government also took very decisive and immediate action, and Nero certainly did benefit from the fire. However, what we lack is all the important series of anomalies and inconsistencies. There is, in fact, no evidence that has ever been offered, not even a little. The best we can say is that Nero might have been behind it. On the other hand, fires were very common in the ancient world. I think the best guess is that the Great Fire was a case of what we can call state opportunism, in which a convenient victim was offered up as a sacrifice for the benefit of powerful interests. Not quite a false flag, but certainly a case of government treachery. Now let's look at the Inquisition. The Inquisition lasted for several centuries in Europe. It was a major extended effort by the Catholic Church to maintain orthodoxy in a time when more and more people began to question elements of church dogma. After all, we're talking about the Renaissance, the age of world exploration, the beginnings of true scientific inquiry. Clearly, you're going to get new ideas entering the world, and that's disruptive for a hierarchy that existed through what can only be described as mind control. So in this context, in the year 1487, a very interesting book was published. This was the Malleus Maleficarum. Its title means the Hammer of Witches. It was really nothing other than a guidebook on how to identify, hunt down, and kill witches. It was extremely influential and was the cause of a great amount of human suffering. But it was quite effective for the purposes of the church. You create a fake enemy, witches. Oh my God, witches in our neighborhood. What are they doing here? Someone has to protect the children. So you terrify the public about witches, but there's a solution. Kill the witches, or rather, find them and bring them to the church. The church will take care of them. No worries, people. We will keep you safe from the witches. A great benefit for the church in all of this was the money that it made. First, through what were known as indulgences. That is, if one of your family members was a witch, you would pay the church money. This could possibly reduce the sentence. If not in this life, then it could help you keep your wife or daughter out of hell and just give her a few thousand years of nasty purgatory. And oh yes, the other thing the church was very good at doing was taking the land of families of witches. The Inquisition helped the church maintain its supremacy over the minds of people in an era of rapid change, development of scientific ideas, and exploration of new lands. You keep them terrified of witches and running to the church for protection. Not a bad strategy, not good for the people, but you can see why the church thought it was awesome. It's estimated, by the way, that over 1 million European women died as a result of the Inquisition.
By shifting the burdens of that terror into other people, by making and constructing otherness, by constructing scapegoats, in this case witches or Jews or lepers, whom we can in a sense blame for the terrible difficulties of our daily existence from the catastrophes of history.
Now I want to talk a little bit about the famous gunpowder plot. The 5th of November, known in Britain as Guy Fawkes Day, commemorates the events of that day from the year 1605, known to history as the Gunpowder Plot or the Gunpowder Treason. England had been going through its version of the Protestant Reformation, but there was still strong support in the country for Catholicism. Many Catholics were still living in the country, so there was definite religious tension. According to the official version of events, a small group of conspirators planned to assassinate King James I, who was a Protestant, and to restore a Catholic king to the throne. The plotters gained access to a space beneath the House of Lords, and one of these people was named Guy Fawkes. Fawkes was a major voice for the rights of English Catholics at that time. Everyone described him as very intelligent, very capable, and as a good person. Everyone liked Guy Fawkes. He was put in charge of the gunpowder that was stockpiled under the House of Lords. And remember, gunpowder in 1605 was not something you would see every day. Yes, there were guns and cannons, but there were still many, many swords as well. Gunpowder was a very advanced substance and the most powerful explosive available at that time. So then came an anonymous letter to the authorities warning them of the plot. Soldiers from the king searched Westminster Palace during the early hours of November 5th. There they found Guy Fawkes guarding the explosives. He also had a pocket watch, which was quite rare at the time, presumably to time his actions according to the plan. Well, Fawkes was tortured and he confessed to treason. The whole event was played up as the salvation of the country. After all, if the plot had succeeded, King James and the Queen would have been dead, along with the members of the House of Lords and the House of Commons. Not surprisingly, the exposure of the plot became a national holiday in the UK. But there's a deeper story to all of this, which has sometimes been called an English equivalent of 9/11. There are suspicious oddities about the whole affair. Researchers have argued that Fawkes was not captured in a basement room, as the official story went. Instead, it was said that he was on a ground floor room, which the plotters had easily been able to rent. The anonymous letter, well, we don't know who wrote it, but we do know who had it and who used it. That was the Royal Chancellor, Sir Robert Cecil, the Earl of Salisbury. This was one of the most scheming politicians of the age and a leading member of the group known as the War Party. They wanted a war with Spain and therefore the chance to make a huge profit. Cecil was a bit like a man who would appear much later in history, J. Edgar Hoover. He ran many spies inside the Catholic dissident community. He was in a position to know pretty much everything worth knowing. Regarding the gunpowder plot, Cecil told the king nothing except for the contents of the anonymous letter. In other words, he kept very close control over information. Interesting. Another interesting thing is that even though Guy Fawkes knew a lot about explosives, the gunpowder found on the scene was not very impressive. It was low-quality gunpowder. Today, it seems impossible that even good quality gunpowder could have done any real damage. And what they found, hardly at all, it would seem. And we also have a statement from a Jesuit historian at the time, a man named John Girard. This wasn't published for 300 years. Only in 1897 did it come out. Now, Girard was obviously pro-Catholic, but the main thing is that he offered a very different, and we have to say logical, interpretation of November 5th. He wrote, quote, "When we examine into the details supplied to us as to the progress of the affair, we find that much of what the conspirators are said to have done is well nigh incredible, while it is utterly impossible that if they really acted in the manner described, the public authorities should not have had full knowledge." Girard was essentially saying, if this so-called plot were true, then we are looking at the dumbest plotters in history. He was skeptical, to say the least. Now, King James himself was not particularly anti-Catholic. Most of his advisors had told him the Catholics in England were nearly all loyal. And there certainly was no indication that any Catholic nation had anything to do with the plot. But we do know that Sir Robert Cecil, who seemed to be pulling many strings on this, did want war with Spain and did take a hardline view against Catholics. So, immediately after the plot was revealed, England's churches, the main avenue of state propaganda at the time, spun the story to the nation. The evil Catholics had tried to kill the king and destroy England. Catholics became seen as the terrorists of their day, and persecution against them increased. It also led to a long period of war between Protestant England and Catholic Spain. Like most of the events of early history, we will never know with certainty all the details of the gunpowder plot, but it's fair to suggest that Sir Cecil and the War Party either made it happen or else allowed the plot to take place, knowing it would play into their hands. This seems very much like later operations of agents provocateurs, in which people are unwittingly coaxed and cajoled into attempting terroristic activity, then nabbed in order to perpetrate the need for authority. Now we turn to the pirates. It's from these fellows of history that we actually get the phrase false flag. Professional historians tell us false flags were not uncommon during the golden age of piracy, the 17th and 18th centuries. During that time, pirates who roamed the world seas would sometimes catch their victims off guard by using the flags of a friendly nation. It was the simplest way to capture an unsuspecting merchant vessel. Before Morse code or electronic signaling, the only way a ship could be identified was by the flag it carried. By the end of the 17th century, national flag designs were well known, and pirates often collected them. British pirates were known sometimes to fly the Union Jack when it suited their purposes. You would think that from a group of people whose activities are the cause of the phrase false flag, that we would have many false flag stories from them. But in fact, we have only a small handful of specific examples of pirate false flags. We're pretty sure they did a number of them, but the details are generally lost to us. Most of them seem to date from the early 1700s. One prominent pirate, Bartholomew Roberts, flew Dutch flags and emulated Dutch signals when he captured 14 French sloops which came to meet him with a lot of money on board, thinking they would purchase slaves from him. In 1723, he performed a classic false flag when he encountered a Spanish merchant ship in the Bay of Honduras. According to one of the leading experts on pirates, historian David Cordingley, Roberts' pirates, quote, hoisted up Spanish colors and continued them till they drew near the sloop. Then they hauled them down, hoisted their black flag, fired a broadside, and boarded her. This shows an important feature of the classic false flag. Before engaging the enemy, the true pirate flag would be raised, and the intended target would then know who they were dealing with. In other words, the false flag was used to lure the victim, but once the true action began, the pirates always revealed their identity. There were two main reasons for this. First, it was simply considered wrong, even perfidious, for a pirate vessel to engage its victim while carrying false colors. Yes, there was a code of honor. But even more important was the fact that the pirate flag was itself an effective weapon, almost always striking fear into the hearts of men on board the target vessel. Generally speaking, though, pirates did not feel the need to use false flags. Generally, they had superior firepower and more men than most other vessels, certainly more than merchant ships, and they were quite confident in their ability to overwhelm their prey. Their terrifying reputation was a bonus. There are a few known examples of false colors being used by the U.S. Navy in its early history, although these are certainly not false flags in the classic sense, as much as they are simply examples of clever disguise being used in warfare. One is the story of the vessel, the USS Revenge, from the American Revolution. Already by 1777, American cruisers were across the Atlantic Ocean trying to carry the war to the British. One of them, the Revenge, under the command of Gustavus Coiningham, captured or burned a number of smaller British vessels in British waters. When in desperate need of refitting, Coiningham boldly led his vessel into a British port in disguise. The ship was refit and repaired in a British harbor and then left unmolested to continue carrying on warfare against the United Kingdom. In 1803, during the Napoleonic Wars, the American frigate Philadelphia ran on the rocks in the harbor of Tripoli and was captured by the people there, the Libyans. The Americans then determined to destroy her. Stephen Decatur sailed into the harbor with a volunteer crew in a little vessel disguised as a fishing boat. The Libyans allowed the Americans to come close, whereupon the Americans boarded the Philadelphia, drove off the crew, set the vessel on fire, and escaped.
Decatur stayed until the last minute and was the last American to leave the burning frigate. This daring action deep in enemy territory proved Americans had the will to defend themselves and meet threats to the nation anywhere, a fighting tradition upheld by our sailors and special operators today.
These accounts of audacity and guile can't truly be considered false flags, but discussing them here is instructive. Both of the cases relating to the early American Navy, or even the events of the pirates of that era, the use of false flags was only intended to lure a targeted enemy into a false sense of security in order to accomplish a specific goal. But these types of false flags were always considered to be a temporary expedient. That is, once you no longer need to fool your enemy, it was perfectly reasonable to reveal your identity. The irony about the phrase false flag, then, is that none of the few examples of false flag operations from the 18th century would really qualify as false flags today. The perpetrators were too honest, even the pirates. That time period did have one event for sure that absolutely qualifies as a true, genuine false flag. It happened in the year 1788 by the government of, wait for it, Sweden. Who knew? King Gustav III of Sweden was an unpopular autocrat. Pretty much everyone was sick of him, especially the nobility. Russia, Sweden's main rival, was openly supporting his political opponents, and Gustav concluded that war was only a matter of time. He also believed, like many rulers before and after him, that a short little war would make him more popular. His problem was that, despite being an autocrat, he still needed the parliament to help declare war. He couldn't do it alone. Another interesting aspect to this situation was that, just as today, the major Western powers, in this case Great Britain, the Dutch Republic, and the Kingdom of Prussia, basically Germany, were afraid of Russian power. Back then, Russia was at war with Turkey and doing very well. So the idea was that a war in the north with Russia would divert Russian attention from its war in the south with Turkey. All very complex. So these three nations whispered to Gustav to make an alliance with Turkey, Russia's enemy, which he did. So now Gustav planned for war. The problem was that war was not a popular idea in Sweden, not even among Swedish generals and officers who were not happy with their king. First, he tried to provoke a war. In June of 1788, the Swedish fleet encountered a Russian squadron in the Baltic Sea. They chased the Russians down and nearly started a war then and there, but the Russian commander very intelligently and diplomatically avoided a conflict, and the Swedes left empty-handed. That's when the Swedes initiated their false flag operation. A head tailor of the Royal Swedish Opera received an order to sew a number of Russian Cossack uniforms. With these uniforms, the Swedes staged an attack on June 27, 1788, at the small Swedish outpost of Pumala, near the Russian border. This is actually part of Finland, but Sweden had controlled Finland for centuries. The fakery did not work perfectly, by the way. Several of the king's critics learned of the costume story and declared that the war was illegal, which it was. But their voices were drowned out by the indignation and outrage in Stockholm and the rest of the nation. Gustav always sought to have as strict control over newspapers as possible, and they covered the outbreak of war just as he wanted. Overall, the false flag worked. It was enough to convince the parliament to allow Gustav to declare a so-called defensive war on Russia. Unfortunately for Sweden, and certainly for Gustav, the war turned out to be a very costly mistake. It lasted for 3 years, and Sweden was the big loser. The initial public support for the war didn't last long. About 22,000 Swedish soldiers died. The Finns hatched their own conspiracy to create an independent Finnish state with Russian support. The nobility's hatred of Gustav only increased, and he was assassinated in 1792. But guess what? In a larger sense, the false flag did work quite well. If not for the Swedes, then for the Western powers who stood behind Sweden. I mean Britain, the Dutch Republic, and Prussia. Because the Swedish war with Russia did divert Russian plans to send its navy into the Mediterranean. In other words, the war with Sweden did serve the interests of the Western powers. Ultimately, it didn't matter very much. The Russians eventually defeated the Turks anyway. And then, of course, Napoleon soon overshadowed everything going on in Europe and pretty much redrew the map. Yet the Swedish false flag of 1788 is a fascinating study. Its purpose was to generate domestic and diplomatic support for a war that had no justification, but which served the interests of a small clique in Sweden and abroad. There were multiple layers of deception here, one by the Swedish government, another in the form of strings being pulled by foreign powers. By the 20th and 21st centuries, such multiple layers of deception would develop into an art form.
When Hitler lashed out at Poland in 1939, the German people followed him into war without regrets. This was the day Germany had been building for and waiting for. And with larceny in their hearts, They gloried in the destruction they were letting loose upon the world.
Sometimes facing the truth can be uncomfortable at first. After a little while at it, however, you will inevitably feel stronger, literally empowered. Why is that? Well, think back to any time in your life when you had an illusion stripped away. It was painful at first, but ultimately you were glad you learned the truth, because the truth does set us free. Reaching the truth means stripping away the illusions around us, so don't despair, just wake up. I'm Richard Dolan. Join me next time on False Flags when we look at 3 fascinating acts of deception: the sinking of the Maine of 1898, the financial scare of 1907, and the sinking of the Lusitania in 1915. Welcome to the modern age of deception.